Okay, I decided that what we're going to do is continue our reading from yesterday. One of the reasons why we decided to read Plutarch is that we want to get in touch with some of our DNA. If there are civilizational challenges before us, let's figure out what we're rooted in. In any event, we read Lycurgus yesterday, and we're going to read Numa, the lawgiver of Rome, today. Like Lycurgus, partly legendary, died 2 centuries after Lycurgus. So we're zooming forward 200 years, but we're still in the midst of early history, prehistory, early history, the dawn of things where it's still legendary. But Plutarch's going to sort all that out and try to give us an accurate enough story of who this individual was. Then what comes after that is the comparison of the two. So Plutarch will do that as well. And so we'll have a chance to look at that. Let's tum a few things here and get links sent and all of that stuff. Is that correct? Yes, it is correct. Okay, good. The link to join, if you're watching on X, is going to be placed right now in the comments of the video. And so you can come on camera if you like. Join on the stream. Okay. And we should be good. Let's get to reading. First, get your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos, your stein, your canteen, jug, or flask, your vessel of any kind. Fill it with your favorite liquid. I like coffee, and join me now for the unparalleled pleasure. The dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens right now. Go. Ah, some good stuff there. Numa Pompilius. Though the pedigrees of noble families of Rome go back in exact form as far as Numa Pompilius, yet there is great diversity amongst historians concerning the time in which he reigned. Right? Like we said yesterday, we're going to be focusing on lots of things. One of them is the conscious development of how to do history scientifically and weigh different sources. Okay, a certain writer called Claudius, in a book of his entitled Strictures on Chronology, avers that the ancient registers of Rome were lost when the city was sacked by the Gauls, and that those which are now extant were counterfeited to flatter and serve the humor of some men who wished to have themselves derived from some ancient and noble lineage, though in reality with no claim to it. And though it be commonly reported that Numa was a scholar and a familiar acquaintance of the Pythagoras, yet it is again contradicted by others who affirm that he was acquainted with neither the Greek language nor learning, and that he was a person of that natural talent and ability as of himself to attain to virtue, or else that he found some barbarian instructor superior to Pythagoras. These are all contentious claims. Some affirm also that Pythagoras was not contemporary with Numa, but lived at least 5 generations after him, and that some other Pythagoras, a native of Sparta, who in the 16th Olympiad, in the third year of which Numa became king, won a prize at the Olympic race, might, in his travel through Italy, have gained acquaintance with Numa and assisted him in the constitution of his kingdom, whence it comes that many Laconian laws and customs appear amongst the Roman institutions. Yet, in any case, Numa was descended of the Sabines, who declare themselves to be a colony of the Lacedaemonians. And chronology in general is uncertain, especially when fixed by the lists of victors in the Olympic Games, which were published at a late period by Hippias the Elean, and rest on no positive authority. I just realized I forgot to send this link to somebody. Hold on a moment. There we go. Commencing, however, at a convenient point, we will proceed to give the most noticeable events that are recorded of the life of Numa. It was the 37th year, counted from the foundation of Rome, when Romulus, then reigning, did on the 5th day of the month of July called the Capritine Nones, offer a public sacrifice at the Goat's Marsh in presence of the Senate and people of Rome. Suddenly the sky was darkened. A thick cloud of storm and rain settled on the earth. The common people fled in affright and were dispersed. And in this whirlwind, Romulus disappeared, his body being never found, either living or dead. A foul suspicion presently attached to the patricians, and rumors were current among the people as if that they, weary of kingly government and exasperated of late by the imperious deportment of Romulus towards them, had plotted against his life and made him away, that so they might assume the authority and government into their own hands. This suspicion they sought to turn aside by decreeing divine honors to Romulus as to one not dead but translated to a higher condition. And Proculus, a man of note, took oath that he saw Romulus caught up into heaven in his arms and vestments, and heard him, as he ascended, cry out that they should hereafter style him by the name of Quir- Quirinus. This trouble, being appeased, was followed by another about the election of a new king. For the minds of the original Romans and the new inhabitants were not as yet grown into that perfect unity of temper, but that there were diversity of factions amongst the commonality and jealousies and emulations amongst the senators. For though all agreed that it was necessary to have a king, yet what person or of which nation was matter of dispute. For those who had been builders of the city with Romulus and had already yielded a share of their lands and dwellings to the Sabines were indignant that any pretension on their part to rule over their benefactors were indignant at any pretension on their part to rule over their benefactors. On the other side, the Sabines could plausibly allege that at their king Tatius's decease, they had peaceably submitted to the sole commands of the Romulus. So now their turn was come to have a king chosen out of their own nation, nor did they esteem themselves to have combined with the Romans as inferiors, nor to have contributed less than they to the increase of Rome, which, without their numbers and association, could scarcely have merited the name of a city. Thus did both parties argue and dispute their cause. But lest meanwhile discord, in the absence of full command, in the absence of all command, okay. But lest meanwhile discord, in the absence of all command, should occasion general confusion, it was agreed that the 150 senators should interchangeably execute the office of supreme magistrate, and each in succession, with the ensigns of royalty, should offer the solemn sacrifices and dispatch public business for the space of 6 hours by day and six by night, which vicissitude and equal distribution of power would preclude all rivalry amongst the senators and envy from the people. When they should behold one elevated to the degree of a king, leveled within the space of a day to the condition of a private citizen. This form of government is termed by the Romans interregnum, nor could they, by this plausible and modest way of rule, escape suspicion and clamor of the vulgar, as though they were changing the form of government to an oligarchy and designing to keep the supreme power in a sort of worship under themselves, without ever proceeding to choose a king. Both parties came at length to the conclusion that the one should choose a king out of the body of the other. The Romans make a choice of Sabine, or the Sabines name a Roman. This was esteemed the best expedient to put an end to all party spirit, and the prince who should be chosen would have an equal affection to the one party as his electors and to the other as his kinsmen. Clever idea. The Sabines remitted the choice to the original Romans, and they too, on their part, were more inclinable to receive a Sabine king elected by themselves than to see a Roman exalted by the Sabines. Consultations being accordingly held, they named Numa Pompilius of the Sabine race, a person of that high reputation for excellence that, though he were not actually residing at Rome, yet he was no sooner nominated than accepted by the Sabines with acclamation almost greater than that of the electors themselves. The choice being declared and made known to the people, principal men of both parties were appointed to visit and entreat him that he would accept the administration of the government. Numa resided at a famous city of the Sabines called Curis, whence the Romans and Sabines gave themselves the joint name of Quirites. Pomponius, an illustrious person, was his father, and he, the youngest of his four sons, being, as it had been divinely ordered, born on the 21st day of April, the day of the foundation of Rome. He was endued with a soul rarely tempered by nature, and disposed to virtue, which he had yet more subdued by discipline, a severe life, and the study of philosophy. Means which had not only succeeded in expelling the baser passions, but also the violent and rapacious temper which barbarians are apt to think highly of. True bravery, in his judgment, was regarded as consisting in the subjugation of our passions by reason. He banished all luxury and softness from his own home. And while citizens alike and strangers found him an incorruptible judge and counselor, in private he devoted himself not to amusement or lucre, but to the worship of the immortal gods and rational contemplation of their divine power and nature. So famous was he that Tadius, the colleague of Romulus, chose him for his son in law and gave him his only daughter, which, however, did not stimulate his vanity to desire to dwell with his father in law at Rome. He rather chose to inhabit with his Sabines and cherish his own father in his old age. And Tatia also preferred the private conditions of her husband before the honor and splendor she might have enjoyed with her father. She is said to have died after she had been married 13 years, and then Numa, leaving the conversation of the town, betook himself to a country life and in a solitary manner frequented the groves and fields consecrated to the gods, passing his life in desert places. And this, in particular, gave occasion to the story about the goddess, namely, that Numa did not retire from human society out of any melancholy or disorder of mind, but because he had tasted the joys of more elevated intercourse and admitted to celestial wedlock in the love and converse of the goddess Ageria, had attained to blessedness and to a divine wisdom. All right, so he has a very good earthly wife. She perishes, and then he's married to that river goddess that we saw in the painting. And may as well, I would pull it up again, but when I upload it to YouTube, who knows if that'll be allowed. So I guess we'll leave it. The story evidently resembles those very ancient fables which the Phrygians, the Perugians, have received and still recount of Attis, the Bithynians of Herodotus, the Arcadians of Endymion, not to mention several others who were thought blessed and beloved of the gods. Nor does it seem strange if God, a lover not of horses or birds, but men, should not disdain to dwell with the virtuous and converse with the wise and temperate soul, though it be altogether hard indeed to believe that any god or daemon is capable of a sensual or bodily love and passion for any human form or beauty. Though, indeed, the wise Egyptians do not plausibly make the distinction that it may be possible for a divine spirit so to apply itself to the nature of a woman as to embreed in her the first beginnings of generation, while on the other side they conclude it impossible for the male kind to have any intercourse or mixture of the body with any divinity, not considering, however, that what takes place on the one side must also take place on the other. Intermixture by force of terms is reciprocal, not that it is otherwise than befitting to suppose that the gods feel towards men affection and love in the sense of affection and in the form of care and solicitude for their virtue and their good dispositions. So it's quite timely that we are happen to be reading C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image at the same time as we're going through the Summa Theologica by Aquinas. And now it's starting to get easier to see the way that these pagans are thinking about the divinities and the exact same logical, spiritual, philosophical theology that's being debated. Like, okay, if I have a divine realm and a daemonic realm that is an intermediary between earth, the terrestrial, and the divine, right? They're working these ideas out very, very carefully, more carefully than we tend to even think about them. All right, so not there's otherwise befitting to suppose that God's with affection of man, and therefore and therefore it was no error of those who feigned that Phorbas, Hyacinthus, and Admetus were beloved by Apollo, or that Hippolytus, the Sicyonian, was so much in his favor that, as often as he sailed from Sicyon to Syra, the Pythian prophetess uttered this heroic verse expressive of the god's attention and joy. Now doth Hippolytus return again and venture his dear life upon the main. It is reported also that Pan became enamored of Pindar for his verses, and the divine power rendered honor to Hesiod and Ar- Archilochus after their death for the sake of the muses. There is a statement also that Asclepius sojourned with Sophocles in his lifetime, of which many proofs still exist, and that when he was dead, another deity took care for his funeral rites. And so, if any credit may be given to these instances, why should we judge it incongruous that a like spirit of the gods should visit Zeleucus, Minos, Zoroaster, Lycurgus, and Numa, the controllers of kingdoms? And the legislators for commonwealths. All right. So he's trying to do a bit of philosophical theology within the pagan framework and say, okay, now wait a minute. Could it really possibly be that after Numa's wonderful earthly wife perished, he went and dwelt in the desert and cared only about theological issues with his soul and ended up cohabitating and marrying a goddess, river deity, like, son of Peneus, probably. So, okay. Uh, He's debating whether or not that's possible, and that's what we just read. It's quite fun. Okay, nay, it may be reasonable to believe that the gods with a serious purpose assist at the councils and serious debates of such men to inspire and direct them and visit poets and musicians, if at all, in their more sportive moods. We saw this with Lycurgus, right? Thales was brought there to bring the sort of poetry to the Lacedaemonians that they might desire order and want to be better ordered before the laws were even given. So the gods, speaking through the muses, inspire the poets, and maybe that's what's going on, he's saying. But also, maybe why not just believe the goddess directly was in love with Numa? It's not common in pagan theology that such a thing could happen. He's listed out why, but he says there are instances. So maybe this is the case. But for difference of opinion here, as but Lydius said, "The road is broad, for there is no absurdity in the account also given that Lycurgus and Numa and other famous lawgivers, having the task of subduing perverse and refractory multitudes and of introducing great innovations, themselves made this pretension to divine authority." All right. So he's no dummy, right? He's saying, well, while I'm trying to weigh out the credibility of various sources saying things about this character who wrote the laws for Rome, I have to admit it would be a pretty difficult task to get everybody to listen to and to decide that the laws would be something they would even try to follow. So I found a motivation for making up the story, right? So what is he doing as a historian? He's looking at all the available texts and weighing their merit, and he's judging them on whether or not they're reasonable, whether or not they're philosophically possible, whether or not they fit in theologically, whether or not they congru with other sources, or if they're lone instances, and whether or not there's motivation to make up the story. Okay, which, if not true, assuredly was expedient for the interests of those it imposed upon. And, he doesn't come to a conclusion there. That's fine. Numa was about 40 years of age when the ambassadors came to make him offers of the kingdom. The speakers were Proculus and Velsus, one of whom It had been thought the people would elect as their new king, the original Romans being for Proculus and the Sabines for Valisus. Their speech was very short, supposing that when they came to tender a kingdom, there needed little to persuade to the acceptance. But contrary to their expectations, we're going to see some wisdom here, right? They found that they had to use many reasons and entreaties to induce one that lived in peace and quietness to accept the government of a city whose foundation and increase had been made in a manner in war. Okay. So, not just, I don't want to be involved in the politics problem, says Numa, specifically this state, this Roman state that has had a lot of turmoil to make it come into being in the first place. That sounds like a foolish thing to do. Why did you elect me king? And again, we see that with these legislators, rather than Caesars and kings and generals, that these legislators, these historical instances of people who are concerned with the proper ordering of the regulatory system and the direction of the people as a people, they half have their foot to in a land of they're half in the mind of how do I shape the characters of the people that they would be about the state, and half in the realm of, okay, what are the right laws to write? And it's all rooted in poetry that has to be sort of foundational. They have to have some understanding of pattern and character and looking for order to even be the raw material to work with. But now we also see another commonality between Lycurgus and Numa, and maybe Numa's a little lesser in this, but there's a hesitation, there's a self-restriction, there's Apollo pulling back the reins. Okay, he's always pulling back the reins, and the lawgiver himself, who's Numa's going to be the lawgiver here, he's hesitant. He's like, whoa, hold on a second, let's not do that. That's messing with some complicated things. It's really difficult. I'm not sure I want the troubles. As Socrates said, only a fool would go into politics because life has enough troubles. Why make other people's troubles your own? But we saw with Lycurgus that a very, very rare, exceedingly rare, wise and virtuous person might be able to produce a statecraft legacy that lasts for centuries. Let's see what happens with Numa. In the presence of his father and his kinsman, Marcius, he returned to answer that, quote, every alteration of a man's life is dangerous to him, but madness only could induce one who needs nothing and is satisfied with everything to quit a life he is accustomed to, which, whatever else it is deficient in, at any rate, has the advantage of certainty over one wholly doubtful and unknown. Okay, first objection, that sounds risky. Though indeed the difficulties of this government cannot even be called unknown. Romulus, all right, so we're going to get more specific, who first held it, did not escape the suspicion of having plotted against the life of his colleague Tatius, nor the Senate the like accusation of having treasonably murdered Romulus. Okay, let's pause. Do you know who the first? We're going to step back just a little bit before history and a little bit before philosophy and just tipping toeing past this down to this poetic level again. The first person to build a city in the Bible, that's recorded in the Bible, is Cain. To interpret, or to attempt to interpret, if you don't mind me putting it forward for what it might be worth, take it with a grain of salt. Fratricide and the necessity of forming a state with a police force are linked. The myths, as well as the historical record, indicate that the reason you have governments in the first place is that some people are psychopathic killers and we need to deal with them. There's opposition to the worst elements of human nature that go into why anybody would want a government in the first place. I mean, it's obvious. Government is to govern. If you govern yourself, you don't need a government. But if you're not governing yourself and there's some people that are very, very much a threat because they're serial killers or something, you might want a police force. So the idea is that government is born out of opposition to humanity. The very first person who steps in after the poets is the lawgiver, and he understands this thing needs to be restrained. Because if we think we have a political solution, my communism will work, my Nazism will work, my fascism will work, I'll define everything and you'll all be ground up in my system and you'll be fodder to prove that I was right about everything. There's nowhere it can go when those beasts run wild except the extermination of all the people. It's born in opposition to humanity. That's its nature. Okay. And so the first thing you get if you're going to have a state that's not just a tyranny that collapses very rapidly is a very wise lawgiver who is restraining himself, who's restraining the laws. The laws are there to restrain the people, but we need constitution. We need to be built in such a way where there's a restraint on that thing. And so we see it historically, and we also see it mythopoetically in the story of Apollo and Daphne, which there's a video on that. Um, the limits, and Phaeton doesn't take his father's lesson in that story, and lots of people die, and new fires come into the world when you forget this lesson, and we forgot this lesson in the last century. That's the text. The poetry says, "Forget this lesson, and new fires will come into the world." And we had to invent the word Holocaust, genocide, and nuclear fire in the last century, which was the first century that we forgot this lesson, that we thought we had political solutions to human suffering and that this was the final answer. So get in line and you can't complain. And inevitably, what happened was what our ancients, who are much smarter than we were, understood and wrote down would happen. New fires came into the world. Let's pay attention and see if we can get some wisdom here. And again, remember that history is not chronology. This is also a story, but this is a story where there's a burden upon the storyteller to give us some empirical support for why it's a version of a story of something that actually happened, right? It's a story about something that actually happened. So it's like literature, it's a story. It's not chronology saying X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened. It is a story, and there's wisdom in it. That's story like wisdom, but it's also a science with an empirical uh, burden upon it. And so it's a very cool subject. So we're sort of studying history while we're studying history. Okay. Satisfied with everything, quit his life at customary items. I'm not going to do it's risky, but beyond that, Romulus, this Tadius thing, murdering, come on, this is fratricidal stuff. Okay. You're forming your city mythologically, the story goes, perhaps historically, with envious brothers who are struggling against the catastrophes of reality and want to murder each other just for doing well. That's not a good part of human nature. We maybe need opposition to human nature, but you want me to get involved with that? This wise man says, Numa? I'm not so sure. All right. Did not escape the suspicion of having plotted against the life of his colleague Tatius, nor the Senate and the like accusation of having treasonably murdered Romulus. Yet Romulus had the advantage to be thought divinely born and miraculously preserved and nurtured. My birth was mortal. I was reared and instructed by men that are known to you. The very points of my character that are most commended mark me as unfit to reign, love of retirement and of studies inconsistent with business, a passion that has become inveterate in me for peace, for unwarlike occupations, and for the society of men whose meetings are but those of worship and of kindly intercourse, whose lives in general are spent among their farms and their pastures. God, I like this Numa guy. I should but be methinks a laughing stock, while I should go about to inculcate the worship of the gods and give lessons in the love of justice and the abhorrence of violence and war to a city whose needs are rather for a captain than for a king. Like, I'm beyond all of that, buddy. I'm out here philosophizing. I'm out here conversing. I'm out here having pleasant conversations in company. I'm out here dedicating and sacrificing and worshiping the deities, worshiping the gods. I am an ascetic. I am in peace. And what a joke it would be for a man to leave that, not just to come run a city and all of the problems that happen with that, but to run a city that's got a lot of murder already involved in it, just at the founding. You might need a general, a captain, you might need a war leader, and I'm not the guy. Okay, so that's his response. The Romans, perceiving by these words that he was declining to accept the kingdom, were the most instant and urgent with him that he would not forsake and desert them in this condition and suffer them to relapse as they must into their former sedition and civil discord. So they know, they're wise enough to say, look, we don't want all that chaos anymore. We need someone to help us out here. It's a Buddha story, right? He's in nirvana. He has to come back for these people. There being no person on whom both parties could accord but on himself, and at length his father and Marcius, taking him aside, persuaded him to accept a gift so noble in itself and tender to him rather from heaven than from men. Though, said they, you neither desire riches, being content with what you have, nor court the fame of authority, as having already the more valuable fame of virtue, yet you will consider that government itself is a service of God, who now calls out into action your qualities of justice and wisdom, which were not meant to be left useless and unemployed. Cease, therefore, they tell him, to avoid and turn your back upon an office which, to a wise man, is a field for great and honorable actions, for the magnificent worship of the gods, and for the introduction of habits of piety, which authority alone can effect amongst a people. Okay, let's look at their arguments, Tim. First of all, your work can be your worship. I think it's less than convincing, but this is the sort of argument that might be working on Numa. He might see some wisdom in this. So that wasn't first of all, that was the second point they made. But they're saying, look, come on, man. This is a noble thing they're asking you to do. It gives you opportunity for honorable and great actions. We know that you don't care about fame, so that argument might not matter so much because you have virtue, which is higher. So we see once again amongst the cynics is where the lawgivers are coming from, the foundational ones, right? Lycurgus, I believe we noticed that he was concerned with virtue and nothing else. But then they says, look, and also think about the dirty rabble. They're not going to get it right. There's no way they're going to find God. But you could introduce the habits of piety to them. The magnificent worship of the gods could be a thing that happens amongst the people if there was a wise person, an authority who could give them the rules that will push them in that direction. They're not going to make it there themselves, but that would be a gift to the gods too, wouldn't it? Tatius, though a foreigner, was beloved, and the memory of Romulus has received divine honors. And who knows, but that this people, being virtuous, victorious, may be satisfied with war and content with the trophies and spoils they have acquired, may be above all things desirous to have a pacific and justice loving prince to lead them to good order and quiet. But if indeed their desires are uncontrollably and madly set on war, were it not better then to have the reins held by a moderating hand, as is able to divert the fury another way, and that your native city and the whole Sabine nation should possess in you a bond of goodwill and friendship with this young and growing power? I find it unconvincing, but it's a good argument, and probably Numa is going to do a heck of a job. So maybe I'm a cynic in the bad way, and he's the one in the good sense. Okay. With these reasons and persuasions, several auspicious omens are said to have concurred, and the zeal also of his fellow citizens, who, on understanding what message the Roman ambassadors had brought him, entreated him to accompany them and to accept the kingdom as a means to unanimity and concord between the nations. Okay, so they're at least voting to say, yeah, you know what, we actually want to be ruled in peace. We don't want to be making war on the world. That's why we want you, Numa. They're at least saying it, so they're aimed in the right direction. We saw that with Lycurgus. The people have to be aimed in the right direction before the lawgiver with wisdom can come and set up the traditions that make it possible for them to thrive. Numa, yielding to these inducements, having first performed divine sacrifice, proceeded to Rome, being met in his way by the Senate and people, who, with an impatient desire, came forth to receive him. The women also welcomed him with joyful acclamations, and sacrifices were offered for him in all the temples. And so universal was the joy that they seemed to be receiving not a new king, but a new kingdom. In this manner, he descended into the forum, where Spurius Vedius, or Vedius, whose turn it was to be interrex at that hour. Okay, so he's going to be king for 6 hours because they keep switching kings every 6 hours or so. Put it to the vote, and all declared him king. Then the regulates, regalites, Oh, the regalities. I'm sorry. I thought we were referring to a type of people. Okay. The regalities and robes of authority were brought to him, but he refused to be invested with them until he had first consulted and been confirmed by the gods. So, being accustomed by the priests and augurs, he ascended the Capitol, which at that time the Romans called the Tarpeian Hill. Then the chief of the augurs covered Numa's head and turned his face towards the south, and standing behind him, laid his right hand on his head and prayed, turning his eyes every way in expectation of some auspicious signal from the gods. It was wonderful, meantime, with what silence and devotion the multitude stood assembled in the forum, in similar expectation and suspense, till auspicious birds appeared and passed on the right. Then Numa, appareling himself in his royal robes, descended from the hill to the people, by whom he was received and congratulated with shouts and acclamations of welcome as a holy king and beloved of all the gods. Okay, step one, pretty good. Hmm. The first thing he did at his so there's so much in this. Let's see what happens. I'm reminded this is not a time for sound bites. I feel the hand of history upon me. The first thing he did at his entrance into government was dismiss the band of 300 men which had been Romulus's lifeguard, called by him Celeris, saying that he would not distrust those who put confidence in him, nor rule over a people that distrusted him. Okay? Again, another parallel. We've got these lawmakers here. Another parallel to Lycurgus, always seemingly a lesser shadow version, actually, of the things Lycurgus did, to be honest, so far. But another parallel. He's refusing to rule by force. I'm going to convince you all that this is the direction we should go, and you're going to choose to follow me here, but I'm not a tyrant. I don't want to waste my time whipping you into doing what I think you should do because you're just going to want to kill me anyway and just get it over with. If you don't want to hear what I have to say, I don't have any bodyguards, so just kill me and get me out of here because I'm wasting my time working on the project in the first place. So this is this is a type of ruler who is a lawgiver and not a king. The next thing he did was to add to the two priests of Jupiter and Mars a third in honor of Romulus, whom he called the Flamen Quirinalis. The Romans anciently called their priests Flamines by corruption of the word Pilumines from a certain cap which they wore called Pilius. In those times, Greek words were more mixed with the Latin than at present. Thus, also the royal robe, which is called lina, Juba says is the same as the Greek kleina, and that the name of Camillus, given to the boy with both his parents living, who serves in the temple of Jupiter, was taken from the name given by some Greeks to Mercury, denoting his office of attendance on the gods. Okay. When Numa had, by such measures, won the favor and affection of the people, he set himself without delay to the task of bringing the hard and iron Roman temper to somewhat more of gentleness and equity. Plato's expression of a city in high fever was never more applicable than to Rome at that time. In its origin, formed by daring and warlike spirits, whom bold and desperate adventure brought thither from every quarter, it had found in perpetual wars and incursions on its neighbors its after sustenance and means of growth, and in conflict with danger and source of new strength, like piles, which the blows of the hammer serve to fix into the ground. Okay, so Numa understood all this before he started. He's like, I don't think I want to come write laws for people who basically only exist because they're making war on everybody and barely are even a people yet. They need to become a people, but you really want me to do that and to help you become a different type of people? This is a big task, and do you really want it? But they showed they wanted it, and he came to do it, and he waited on the gods to approve, And so he's setting off on this, but he's got a big task to do. And we saw this with Lycurgus. It was Mad Max, as Roger pointed out yesterday. It was Mad Max when Lycurgus showed up. And before he even starts giving them any laws at all, he says, Thales, come here, teach these people some music so that they can start to fall in love with order and pattern, help their souls out that way. I'm going on a journey. I'm going to study laws of other nations. I'm coming back. But these people need to get some regularity and the desire for the beauty of that sort of thing if they're ever going to really accept and embody a way of being and have laws that really are not something that are just imposed upon them. Okay. Wherefore Numa, judging it no slight undertaking to mollify and bend to peace the presumptuous and stubborn spirits of this people, began to operate upon them with the sanctions of religion. Okay. Once again, we see another pattern of what the founding fathers said. These laws are not going to work if you're not a religious and an ethical people. If you're not disciplined, if you don't govern yourself, you will be governed, but you'll be governed by tyrants if you don't govern yourself. You get the government you deserve. If you can govern yourself, we might be able to set up a joyful state. We might be able to set up a way of living that makes you want to live that way and it lasts hundreds of years, as the Spartan one did for 500 years before corruption came in. Wherefore Numa, judging it no slight undertaking to mollify and bend to peace the presumptuous and stubborn spirits of the people, he says, look, let's figure out how to make these people more religious first. He sacrificed often, so he's doing it by leadership, by example. He sacrificed often and used processions and religious dances, in which most commonly he officiated in person. Okay, now this is not something you can fake, right? Lycurgus or Numa, when he's living in the desert with the goddess, possibly as his wife. I mean, there was some mythological talk about that. But while he's living out there, having good conversations with people and being polite, he's spending most of his time sacrificing. He's spending most of his time saying, the only thing I really care about is communing with the gods and understanding what right order is in my soul and being in connection with them. So when he comes to do this, it's not an act. It's not, hey, this would be a useful way to trick people into not being so warlike and then we'll have a more peaceful state. It's, let me teach you how to live. That's really what's going on here with Numa and with Lycurgus. It's a father coming and saying, let me show you how to live. He sacrificed often and used processions and religious dances, in which most commonly he officiated in person, by such combinations of solemnity with refined and humanizing pleasures, seeking to win over and mitigate their fiery and warlike tempers. At times, also, he filled their imaginations with religious terrors, professing that strange apparitions had been seen and dreadful voices heard, thus subduing and humbling their minds by a sense of supernatural fears. So it's like, look, these people are warlike. We've got to get them fearing God. We've got to get them thinking there's something bigger than Phil. I got to make sure I'm doing the right thing. This is why the plays were so helpful. You know, the tragedies are basically look how proud you think you are, but the gods might be screwing with you, and you're not thinking about that, and you come to a very bad end and not even know it's coming. So he's saying, like, let's get the fear of God into these people and let's get them to start loving. So it's carrot and stick at the same time. Start loving the idea of beautiful cosmic order that they might participate in. So this method, which Numa used, made it believed that he had been much conversant with Pythagoras, for in the philosophy of the one, as in the policy of the other, man's relations to the deity occupied a great place. It is said also that the solemnity of his exterior garb and gestures was adopted by him from the same feeling with Pythagoras. For it is said of Pythagoras that he had taught an eagle to come at his call and stoop down to him in his flight, and that as he passed among the people assembled at the Olympic Games, he showed them his golden thigh, besides many other strange and miraculous seeming practices on which Timian, the Philasian, wrote the dispatch. Who of the glory of a juggler proud with solemn talk imposed upon the crowd. In like manner, Numa spoke of a certain goddess or mountain nymph that was in love with him and met him in secret, as before related, and professed that he entertained familiar conversations with the muses, to whose teaching he ascribed the greatest part of his revelations. And amongst them, above all, he recommended to the veneration of the Romans one in particular whom he called Tacita, the silent, which he did perhaps in imitation and honor of the Pythagorean silence. His opinion also of images is very agreeable to the doctrine of Pythagoras. So, this is a thesis that he's questioning and bringing up evidence for us how influenced he was by Pythagoras. But we get to see some details along the way as well. So, his opinion also of images is very agreeable to the doctrine of Pythagoras, who conceived the first principle of being as transcendent sense and passion, invisible and incorrupt, and only to be approached by abstract intelligence. So Numa forbade the Romans to represent God in the form of man or beast. Nor was there any painted or graven image of a deity admitted amongst them for the space of the first 170 years, all of which time their temples and chapels were kept free and pure from images. To such baser objects they deemed it impious to liken the highest, and all access to God impossible except by the pure act of intellect. His sacrifice also had great similitude to the ceremonial of the Pythagoras, for they were not celebrated with effusion of blood, but consisted of flour, wine, and the least costly offerings. Other external proofs, too, are urged to show the connection Numa had with Pythagoras. The comic writer Epicharmus, an ancient author, and of the school of Pythagoras, in a book of his dedicated to Antenor, records that Pythagoras was made a freeman of Rome. Pythagoras was made a freeman of Rome. Again, Numa gave to one of his four sons the name of Mamercus, which was the name of one of the sons of Pythagoras, from whence, as they say, sprang the ancient patrician family of the Ameli. For that, the king gave him in sport the surname of Amelius, for his engaging and graceful manner in speaking. I remember too that when I was in Rome, I heard many say that when the oracle directed two statues to be raised, one to the wisest and another to the most valiant man in Greece, they erected two of brass, one representing Alcibiades and the other Pythagoras. Okay, so he's just adding the evidence here that there's maybe a connection between Pythagoras and the way Numa is thinking and his decisions here, maybe familiarity between them. But to pass by these matters, which are full of uncertainty and not so important as to be worth our time to insist on them, you can also see in those ideas, those founding ideas that are in philosophical form and partially in philosophical theatrical form, that's partially mythopoetic form, a lot of the later, more advanced philosophical ideas. I mean, you can just see them in there, right? I mean, obviously Pythagoras was a pre-Socratic philosopher, but you can see with all our readings of Plato that we've been doing, some important concepts that I won't go back and highlight now. Okay, but to pass these matters, which are full of uncertainty and not so important as to be worth our time to insist on them, the original constitution of the priests, called pontifices, is ascribed unto Numa. And he himself was, it is said, the first of them, and that they have the name of pontifices from potens, powerful, because they attend the service of the gods, who have power to command over all. Others make the word refer to exceptions, excuse me. Others make the word refer to exceptions of impossible cases. The priests were to perform all the duties possible to them. If anything lay beyond their power, the exception was not to be cavilled at. The most common opinion is the most absurd, which derives this word from pons and assigns the priests the title of bridge makers. The sacrifices performed on the bridge were amongst the most sacred and ancient, in the keeping of repairing the bridge attached, like any other public sacred office to the priesthood. It was accounted not simply unlawful, but a positive sacrilege to pull down the wooden bridge, which moreover is said, in obedience to an oracle, to have been built entirely of timber and fastened with wooden pins, without nails or cramps of iron. The stone bridge was built a very long time when Emilius was Castor. And they do indeed say also that the wooden bridge was not so old as Numa's time, but that was finished by Ancus Marcius. when he was king, who was the grandson of Numa by his daughter. Okay, so he's again doing history. He's saying, well, this source is this source is this. The one that's ridiculous is the one that says it was based on the bridge thing, because that didn't happen for two generations later. So we've got a timeline here, so that can't be where the name came from. So again, he's in real time that he's telling us the story. He's showing us the reasoning process that he's using for weighing out different sources for what might be true about the details of the story. Okay. The office Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, was to declare and interpret the divine law, or rather, to preside over sacred rites. He not only prescribed rules for public ceremony, but regulated the sacrifices of private persons, not suffering them to vary from established custom, and giving information to every one of what was requisite for purposes of worship or supplication. He was also guardian of the Vestal Virgins, the institution of whom and of their perpetual fire was attributed to Numa, who perhaps fancied the charge of pure and uncorrupted flames would be fitly entrusted to chaste and unpolluted persons, or that fire, which consumes but produces nothing, bears an analogy to the virgin estate. In Greece, wherever a perpetual holy fire is kept, as at Delphi and Athens, the charge of it is committed not to virgins, but widows past the time of marriage. And in case by any accident it should happen that this fire became extinct, as the holy lamp was at Athens under the tyranny of Aristion, and at Delphi when that temple was burnt by Medes, or by the Medes, excuse me, by the Medes, as also in the time of the Mithridatic and Roman Civil War, when not only the fire was extinguished, but the altar demolished. Then afterwards, in kindling this fire again, it is esteemed an impiety to light it from common sparks or flame, or from anything but the pure and unpolluted rays of the sun, which they usually effect by concave mirrors of a figure formed by the revolution of an isosceles rectangular triangle at all the lines from the circumference of which meeting in a center. By holding it in the light of the sun, they can collect and concentrate all its rays at this one point of convergence, where the air will now become rarefied, and any light, dry, combustible matter will kindle as soon as applied under the effect of the rays, which here acquire the substance and active force of fire. Okay, we are seeing Aristotelian physics. We're seeing that early fourth century transitional period into the Middle Ages of the way of thinking about how this stuff works, right? And it's being described in that way. So while we've been reading Aquinas, the Summa Theologica, we've been reading C.S. Lewis on the discarded image, the way that these people thought. The story here about Numa is from the 7th century BC, but it's being written in the 1st century AD, I think in 75 AD. So, and we're also seeing what C.S. Lewis pointed out, that the pagans were not dancing naked in the woods and having a good time while the dour spiritual Christians were deciding to make everything all sourpuss. Instead, you're seeing the exact opposite. You're seeing a pagan desire to come to a singular order and to be very much concerned with none of this wildness, but instead to be rightly ordered with a divine that is above them, right? There's this level above them that they can't quite reach, but that they need to be oriented towards. So we're getting a lot of insights into the way these people think. It's opening up the way that we can understand these stories. And the history is also interesting. So let's continue. Some are of opinion that these Vestals had no other business than the preservation of this fire, but others conceive that they were keepers of other divine secrets concealed from all but themselves, of which we have told all that may lawfully be asked or told in the life of Camillus. Now, he's not going to give away everything, but if you go read the life of Camillus, you can get all that can be lawfully asked or told about these secret divine matters. Okay. Gigania and Verenia, it is recorded, were the names of the first two virgins consecrated and ordained by Numa. Canulia and Tarpeia succeeded. Servius afterwards added to, and the number of four has continued the present time. Okay, so look at what Numa is concerned with. Hey, I'm coming to write laws for this new place called Rome. What am I going to do? This is not lawmaking. This is nation founding. It's statecraft lawmaking. It's constitution writing, is what it really is. Okay. Just like with Lycurgus that we read yesterday. This isn't just, hey, I'm going to write a law. You probably shouldn't kill each other. Okay, that's a good idea. This is constitutional. This is constitutional. It's constituting a people and saying, this is who we are. This is our story. This is the way we do our habits and our behaviors so that we're oriented towards the right things. And the first things he's doing is saying, okay, this warlike, crazy group of people need to start fearing the gods and they need to start caring about sacrifices. So I'm going to institute the people who are in charge of making sure that to a man, they're doing the sacrifices properly. We're not just going to say, hey, it's in the calendar. We all sacrifice on this day. It's here's the guy in charge. Here are the powerful people in the priesthood who you need to go to make sure that you're doing it right. It's the first thing he's caring about. The statutes prescribed by Numa for the Vestals were these: that they should take a vow of virginity for the space of 30 years, the first 10 of which they were to spend in learning their duties, the second 10 in performing them, and the remaining 10 in teaching and instructing others. Thus, the whole term being completed, it was lawful for them to marry, and leaving the sacred order, to choose any condition of life that pleased them. But this permission few, as they say, made use of. And in cases where they did so, it was observed that their change was not a happy one, but accompanied ever after with regret and melancholy, so that the greater number from religious fears and scruples forbore and continued to old age and death in the strict observance of a single life. So there's four privileged women will get these jobs at any time of tending to the flame and making sure it stays on and teaching each other how to do it. And they have to do it for 30 years. And that's the history there. From this condition, he compensated by great privileges and prerogatives as they as that they had power to make and to make a will in the lifetime of their father, that they had a free administration of their own affairs without guardian or tutor, which was the privilege of women who were the mothers of three children. When they go abroad, they have the fasces carried before them. And if in their walks they chance to meet a criminal on his way to execution, it saves his life upon oath made that the meeting was an accidental one and not concerted or of set purpose. Anyone who presses upon the chair on which they are carried is put to death. If these Vestals commit any minor fault, they are punishable by the high priest only, who scourges the offender, sometimes with her clothes off in a dark place, with a curtain drawn between. But she that has broken her vow is buried alive near the gate called Colina, where a little mound of earth stands inside the city, reaching some little distance, called a Latin ager. Under it, a narrow room is constructed, to which a descent is made by stairs. Here, they prepare a bed and light a lamp, and leave a small quantity of victuals, such as bread, water, a pail of milk, and some oil, so that so that body that body which had been consecrated and devoted to the most sacred service of religion might not be said to perish by such a death as famine. The culprit herself is put in a litter, which they cover over and tie her down with cords on it, so that nothing she utters may be heard. They then take her to the forum. All people silently go out of the way as she passes, and such as follow accompany the bier with solemn and speechless sorrow. And indeed, there is not any spectacle more appalling, nor any day observed by the city with greater appearance of gloom and sadness. All right, so they're not mocking her; they're not happy about this. This is like one of the gravest and worst things that can possibly happen in their city. Okay, these women who are virgins but who have the authority of married women who've had at least three children, and they have a place of respect and honor, and they have a most sacred duty that they're doing. If they make any error, it's kind of nobody's business. But if they make the one big error that they're not allowed to make, it's a big deal. But it's not a big deal like you imagine, like a lynching or something, where people are like happy that this is happening. This is like the city itself is dying while they're witnessing this happen. I mean, it's as close to as tragic as that for the spectators who have to witness this thing. When they come to the place of execution, the officers loose the cords, and then the high priest, lifting his hands to heaven, pronounces certain prayers to himself before the act. Then he brings out the prisoner, being still covered, and placing her upon the steps that lead down to the cell, turns away his face with the rest of the priests. The stairs are drawn up after she has gone down, and a quantity of earth is heaped up over the entrance to the cell, so as to prevent it from being distinguished from the rest of the mound. This is the punishment of those who break their vow of virginity. It is said also that Numa built the temple of Vesta, which was intended for a repository of the holy fire. I mean, that's quite a horrifying picture, right? This is like we see with Numa, the establishment of traditions that are meant to make you fear and tremble, that are meant to make you go, Wait a minute. I can't just be a brute who's going around Mad Max style. That's how we maybe form this city. We need to become different types of people. And so he's setting out to alter the way they are, and he's making them focus on religious ceremonies and giving them things to aspire to and things to have awe and respect for, and also gods to fear and things to be terrified of, lest they should mess up. So he's changing their focus a little bit into the direction where they might be self-governing. It is said also that Numa built the temple of Vesta, which was intended for a repository of the holy fire of a circular form, not to represent the figure of the earth, as if that were the same as Vesta, but that of the general universe, in the center of which the Pythagoreans place the element of fire and give it the name of Vesta, the unit, and do not hold that the earth is immovable or that it is situated in the center of the globe, but that it keeps a circular motion about the seat of fire and is not in the number of the primary elements, and this agreeing with the opinion of Plato, who they say in his later life conceived that the earth held a lateral position and that the central and sovereign space was reserved for some nobler body. As C.S. Lewis has pointed out, every ancient and medieval person knew that the earth was round. Every ancient and medieval person who had the question in their mind at all. I mean, obviously, there's some people today who they don't think the earth is round. They don't think the earth is flat. They just don't think about the shape of the earth. There were obviously people like that back then, but everybody who asked the question knew that the stars were globes that dwarfed the earth, right? None of this is like something they're unaware of. And at the same time, as C.S. Lewis points out in the book that we're reading, and we're going to try to finish reading soon while we're doing our Summa Theologica in Aquinas, which happens to be the same time that we decided to start reading this just as an off thing. At the same time as they had astrophysics, they had cosmology. And you hear in the story here descriptions of understanding the cosmos as being ordered in a certain way, but then a cosmology which talks about it in a different way. And as C.S. Lewis points out, the purpose of the medieval cosmology, which is a story about your place in the universe and in relation to higher and lower realms, is not the same as the astrophysics as you might understand it. But it's also the material description is a photographic negative of the spiritual reality. So by putting the earth at the center, they're saying it is the most marginal of the most marginal things. Because when you go up through layers, you see the concave domes, but when you come back down, they're convex. And so when you're up in heaven, seeing all with wisdom, you see how pointless and stupid and meaningless all the things on earth are that were concerning you. So the way of describing that is to put it at the center. So not only did they understand the astrophysics and understood cosmology as something different, which we can do today, we can say, okay, this is the physical reality, but what's the story that tells the truth about my place in the universe? And right now, we're just sort of pretending they're both the same thing, and people are doing it badly, mostly like you would expect. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. But not only do they have both of those in mind, but their understanding of their cosmological story is not the one that we were thinking that they understood as well. So, and we see here that geocentrism is not anthropocentrism, it's anthropoperiphery, but also astrophysically, they weren't even geocentrists to begin with. So, anyway, it's at least an idea that's out there from eminent authorities. Okay, let's move on. There was yet a farther use of the priests. and that was to give people directions in the national usages at funeral rites. Numa taught them to regard these offices not as a pollution, but as a duty paid to the gods below, into whose hands the better part of us is transmitted. Especially, they were to worship the goddess Libitina, who presided over all the ceremonies performed at burials, whether they meant hereby Prosperina, Proserpina, or, as the most learned of the Romans conceive, Venus, not inaptly attributing the beginning and end of man's life to the agency of one and the same deity. Numa also prescribed rules for regulating the days of mourning according to certain times and ages. As, for example, a child of 3 years was not to be mourned for at all, one older, up to 10 years, for as many months as it was years old, and the longest time of mourning for any person whatsoever was not to exceed the term of 10 months, which was the time appointed for women that lost their husbands to continue in widowhood. If any married again before that time, by the laws of Numa, she was to sacrifice a cow big with calf. Ooh, that's a rough one. Okay, Numa also was founder of several other orders of priests. Okay, so he is really, really into this whole we need to be. Now, notice this is a pagan trying to establish a severe enough religious mindset that he can take a warlike and chaotic people and turn them into a blessed and well-ordered people who can have a political tradition that lasts. And his concern is stoic is cynical, not cynical in the way we use it, but cynical in the ancient sense of I don't care for anything of this world. I only care about ordering my soul and figuring that out and being right with the gods. That's the virtue is the only thing to worry about. So this guy who's concerned with that, as I said, is trying to make laws that will turn a people into something that will be a state that is aimed in the right direction according to that person's perspective, which we know what his perspective is based on how he was living. And so he is just establishing orders of priests and regulations and ceremonies and rules for how you sacrifice and who's in charge of what. And okay, he's establishing traditions, I guess. Sounds like a contradiction in terms. And we know that this is one foot in legend. So we're going to have to try to figure out what's exactly being told here. But Plutarch is with us. He understands that it's one foot in legend as he tries to sort out the various sources to say, okay, what did he do and what didn't he do? And what laws did he make? And what type of person was he? Okay, Numa also was founder of several other orders of priests, two of which I shall mention, the Salii and the Thessialis, which were among the clearest proofs of the devoutness and sanctity of his character. These Thessials, or guardians of peace, seem to have had their name from their office, which was to put a stop to disputes by conference and speech. Okay, these are priests whose job is to mediate arguments. For it was not allowed to take up arms until they had declared all hopes of accommodation to be at an end. Now, there's a political institution. There's an interesting political institution. These constitutionalists are quite interesting at the and clever at the stuff that they create. So, okay, y- imagine being Numa and deciding you want to make people not be really warlike at every freaking excuse. Okay, well, you're not gonna be able to tell them, "Just don't be warlike," because 'cause they're gonna be warlike. Well, maybe you can work on making them afraid of the gods and caring about ceremony and thinking about religious sacrifices and doing them properly, and that might get them focused in a better direction, but when they have conflicts, how are you gonna stop them from saying, "Hey, I know how to handle conflict. Handle conflicts by beating somebody up and taking what you want, and that's how we got our city in the first place." He's got to redefine for them what their city is. He's gotta give them a new identity, a new meaning of what it means to be Roman, right? Because if he wasn't there to do that, what it means to be Roman is to kick ass and steal shit and barely hold it together and try to make a coalition and then say, we need a king to turn us into a people here because we're really not one yet. And so it's just going to be chaos. It's Mad Max again. Now, here's your question. You're Benjamin Franklin, you're Numa, you're Thomas Jefferson. You're trying to think of how to organize the institutions, how to constitute the government in such a way that you can take a people like that and help orient them towards the divine concerns better. Well, making a law saying you can't fight people unless X or Y, it's like you're gonna fight with the fighting rules. You're gonna make legal arguments about whether or not somebody crossed a line, and it's not gonna solve the problem. What if you had an institution that says you get to fight? You definitely get to fight after we approve. You have to come to us, and our job as a priests here is to see if we can use words to settle the argument. And only when we decide that words will never work can there be an opening for something else. That's a cool idea. So what is that principle, right? It's monopoly of force in the government in a sense, but um now that we've gotten rid of duels in our culture, which we shouldn't, but we kind of had to after we let women have the right to vote because the honor of politics would lead to duels, but you can't be letting that realm be feminized and still have duels. But before we had duels, that's sort of the way it was, right? We're going to fight, we're going to talk, we're going to negotiate, we're going to contrive, and we're going to try to get coalitions together. We're going to try to pass the laws we want. But I don't like you, and you don't like me, and it's getting pretty heated. Well, you could challenge someone to a duel. That's an official way of saying, okay, I don't think the words are working, but I'm going to use some words to formally and civilly invite you to stand behind what you said about me because I say it's not true. And let's see if you really want to say it or if you just wanted it out and about as gossip. And are you going to be a man of your word or not? And then we have to go and face each other. And usually, we choose not to shoot each other, but at least we've put on the show that we're willing to stand behind what we're saying and that type of thing. So there's like a place for violence because it's kind of underneath the surface of all of this. And the civilizational project is not, can we eradicate violence? Yeah, you can do that. You could just neuter everybody and enslave them and put them in a matrix or something. But that's not the solution we're looking for because we have to hold back the reins because we're against the worst elements of human nature. But that doesn't mean that we're against being able to get shit done and doing what needs to be done. And when there's foreign invaders, we need some violent people around who can help us out. Like, we're not trying to kill ourselves over this, but we're trying to civilize ourselves. And so to civilize ourselves, we have to have institutions that put appropriate expressions of violence behind a wall of and barriers of tradition and established things that have to happen first. All right. And that's, of course, what we're living in today. Now, in our day, without duels, we just have a monopoly of violence in the third party of the government. And we just say, look, if you steal or do something and it's against the law, we're going to put you in jail. That's violence. We're going to take you and we're going to stop you from going where you want. And you don't get to choose where you sleep at night. And we're physically putting you here. And we got guards with guns. So we still have the violence there. There's no getting rid of that unless you do something really horrible and get rid of humanity entirely, which is the mistake that totalitarians sometimes will make when they're trying to have a utopia. But the wise man is in the middle here. He's holding back the reins. He goes, okay, there's some wilds here. There's some violent things, but like Apollo, I'm going to hold back the reins. And so Numa is putting institutional restrictions in that are allowing for the fact that humanity needs to be free. And at the same time is a force back against the worst elements of what happens with humans. Okay. So the Romans commonly dispatched the officials and heralds to those who had offered them injury, requesting satisfaction. So this is cool. This is third party. So when I said third party monopoly on violence, this is actually third party solution as well. So this institution isn't just the one that says, okay, it's gotten to the point where words are not enough. So let's decide where this is going to be settled. It's not only that, it's a third party. So it's the beginning of justice. It's the idea of an disinterested, dispassionate party that's in charge of trying to work out the dispute. So you and I try to form a business. We have a contract. I've got apple trees, and I say I'm going to sell you all my apples for $100. But then you find out that I sold some of them to somebody else, and I told another guy he could have them for $200. And now you're like, wait a minute, you promised them to me, and that was in the contract, and now we're fighting about stuff. we can fight, and you know how it is when you talk with a person, they just sort of make up any nonsense, especially if they're dishonest to begin with, and it just gets more and more violent and more crazy. But or you can hire the priests, they're called priests here, these lawyers who say, okay, look, our job is to settle this. I don't give a shit about your apples and I don't give a shit about your $200. I'm here just, my only interest is in finding the right solution. My only interest is different than yours. I'm not on your team and I'm not on your team. And if it was just you two against each other, things are going to escalate Hatfields and McCoys. But if there's a third party that's only interested in justice, in the law, in legality, in some principle, maybe just interested in resolution. I mean, we don't know exactly how these priests are going to be functioning, but whatever they're interested in, they're not on the side of any one party. So a Roman who's upset can say, hey, this guy's cheating me here, and I'm not happy about it. He dispatched these fecials or heralds to those who had offered them injury, requesting satisfaction. So you don't even have to go and serve them with papers. They'll go and do it for you. It's like a court that also serves papers to the person that's being sued. And in case they refused, they then called the gods to witness, and with imprecations upon themselves and their country, should they be acting unjustly, so declared war against their will or without their consent. It was lawful neither for soldier nor king to take up arms. Okay. So after these guys say, all right, there's no way to resolve this, that's just being an asshole. And what am I going to do? I'm just the guy that you got to talk to, right? So so it's a separation of powers. It's a judicial branch that's emerging here, but it's not one with a lot of potency, except that everybody knows you go to them first and you are not allowed to do anything. You can't go to war with the people, you can't fight with any, you can't do any of that stuff unless they have exhausted their ability to resolve it peacefully with agreement. So it was lawful neither for soldier nor kings to take up arms. So the king can't say, let's go to war and take the plunder of these people that live near us and we'll make ourselves greater. That would be illegal. All right. So it's a separation of powers from the executive and the judicial. He set up these priests as a check on executive power. The war was begun with them. And when they had first handed it over to the commander just as a just quarrel, then his business was to deliberate of the manner and ways to carry it on. Okay, so the executive can do executive things, but the judicial is deciding when it's lawful and when it's not lawful to be at war. They have to decide and declare war and then hand over the business to the person who's in charge of the army. All right. In American system, Congress is supposed to declare war. The judicial branch is judging whether or not everybody's doing what they're supposed to do and other things like that. And the executive branch is leading the military cause. Uh, Numa has set up a kind of a quasi-religious, quasi-judicial branch that is trying to work out all conflicts any way other than violently. And only when they decide, they have the full authority to say whether or not this has to be advanced to another stage. They can delay it. They can say, well, we're going to take another year and see if we can find a way. But when they've decided, okay, this is leading to trouble and there's no way to resolve it except with violence, then they declare war and then they step aside. And they say, now that we've declared war, you guys that are more about the war stuff, this is your job now. But we're already at war because we decided, but we're the only ones who can ever decide. And our job is to try not to decide that, to only when it has to be. Quite an interesting system. It is believed that the slaughter and destruction which the Gauls made of the Romans was a judgment on the city for neglect of this religious proceeding. For that, when these barbarians besieged the Clusinians, Fabius Ambustus was dispatched to their camp to negotiate peace for the besieged. So he's one of these priests who was dispatched. Hey, let's go get peace over this. And on their returning a rude refusal, Fabius imagined that his office of ambassador was at an end, and rashly engaging on the side of the Clusinians, challenged the bravest of the enemy to a single combat. It was the fortune of Fabius to kill his adversary and to take his spoils. But when the Gauls discovered it, they sent a herald to Rome to complain against him. Holy mackerel. Let's pause. So we're fast forwarding to when these laws are established a bit and saying, look how seriously they took these laws. The priest is supposed to go out, this priest judge is supposed to go out and try to make peace with words. This particular one says, you know what? I can probably settle this by just being willing to a one-on-one combat. That's not with words. That's not his prerogative. He doesn't have the right to use violence or to say it's okay to fight in this specific way. He has to give that up. When it's time for war, you're not involved anymore. Let the people who want to kill as much as possible be in charge. They'll probably be more likely to win, whatever. You don't get to do clever things like that, buddy. Your job is to resolve it with words. If you can't, you declare war and then it's out of your hands. What this guy did was said, well, geez, I probably can settle this. I'll get them to agree to a one-on-one fight and we'll settle it that way. And of course, the losers looked at that and said, now hold on a second. You're not allowed to do that. You can't say, here's a way that you're allowed to fight. You can say fighting is now necessary. That's all you can do. You can declare war and say fighting is now necessary. That's the only thing you can do. You don't have the right to try to settle it with violence after that. So they sued and they said, come on, this guy was supposed to settle things or declare war, and he did neither. He did something he wasn't allowed to do. And the story is that the reason why the Gauls were allowed to sack them was that the gods were displeased that they disobeyed these laws, which are thought of as pretty holy. Okay, so let's see what happens. The matter being debated in the Senate, the Fetials were of opinion that Fabius ought to be consigned into the hands of the Gauls, but he, being forewarned of their judgment, fled to the people by whose protection and favor he escaped the sentence. On this, the Gauls marched with their army to Rome, where, having taken the capital, they sacked the city. The particulars of all, which are fully given in the history of Camillus. I'll have to read that one sometime. That's pretty intense, but now we understand the legal framework of that. The origin of the Sali is this. In the 8th year of the reign of Numa, a terrible pestilence which traversed all Italy ravaged likewise the city of Rome, and the citizens, being in distress and despondent, a brazen target, they say, fell from heaven into the hands of Numa, who gave them this marvelous account of it, that Egeria and the Muses, that's his goddess wife, and the Muses had assured him it was sent from heaven for the cure and safety of the city, and that to keep it secure, he was ordered by them to make 11 others, so that in dimensions and form to the original, that no thief should be able to distinguish the true from the counterfeit. He farther declared that he was commanded to consecrate to the Muses the place and the fields about it where they had been chiefly wont to meet with him. Now, what you might be asking yourself, why is the constitutional government legislator that we're reading about having anything to do with medicine? We've already accepted that he's got one foot in the mythopoetic here, but why does he have anything to do with medicine? Apollo is the god of medicine. There's something of the bare bones sliver, real fundamental nature of the Apollonian, of the thing that has to hold back the reins because it's sort of dangerous to humanity and yet it's there to stave off human suffering. There's something of that that's in common between medicine and supreme courts and imperial administration of governance and symphonic non-lyrical music. And like, what is that? It's it's one of two heroes. It's the hero who is approaching an impossible task of near infinite complexity and making order out of it, cutting it into pieces, figuring out what all the plants do for ill and good, and systematically breaking it down until you can see the way it's supposed to go, and then orient it with the least possible influence that you need to give in order to something that can create a harmony of flourishing, and it can't be a final solution. In any event, so there's this big bad pestilence and there's this stuff from the gods, and we've got Numa, and Numa's concerned with the things of the gods. And so let's see if he can help fix this problem. This is like a raise the snake up on the stick sort of solution. So he declared, da da da. He further declared that he was commanded to consecrate it to the Muses, the place and the fields about it, where they had been chiefly wont to meet with him, and that the spring which watered the fields should be hallowed for the use of the Vestal virgins, who were to wash and cleanse the penetralia of their sanctuary with those holy waters. The truth of all, which was speedily verified by the cessation of the pestilence. Okay, so once he did all of that, the disease stopped. Numa displayed the target to the artificers and bade them show their skill in making others like it. All despaired until at length one Mamurius Veturius, an excellent workman, happily hit upon it and made all so exactly the same that Numa himself was at a loss and could not distinguish. The keeping of these targets was committed to the charge of certain priests called Salai, who did not receive their name, as some tell the story, from Salius, a dancing master born in Samothrace, or at Montenea, who taught the way of dancing in arms, but more truly from that jumping dance which the Sali themselves use when in the month of March they carry their sacred targets through the city. At which procession they are habited in short frocks of purple, girt with a broad belt studded with brass. On their heads they wear a brass helmet and carry in their hands short daggers, which they clash every now and then against the targets. But the chief thing is the dance itself. They move with much grace, performing in quick time and close order various intricate figures with a great display of strength and agility. The targets were called ancilia from their form, for they are not made round, nor like proper targets of a complete circumference, but are cut out in a wavy line, the ends of which are rounded off and turned in at the thickest part towards each other, so that their shape is curvilinear, or in Greek, ancillon, or the name may come from ankon, the elbow, on which they are carried. Thus, Juba writes, who is eager to get Greek, but it might be, for that matter, from its having come down from anakathen, from above, or from the akesis, the aether, right? Or cure of disease, or euchomon, Eucman lysis, because it put an end to a drought, or from its anasthesis, or relief from calamities, which is the origin of the Athenian name of Anachus, given to Castor, and Pollux. If we must, it is, that is, reduce it to Greek. The reward, so he's just trying to figure out the name and where the name of all that came from, but we know how the story got it established. The rewards which Mamurius received for his art was to be mentioned and commemorated in the verses which the Sali sang as they danced in their arms through the city, though some will have it that they do not say veturium mamuium, but veterum memoriam, ancient remembrance. Okay, so there's the cloud of mystery around all of this. He's saying, here's a couple of ideas. Sometimes he'll say, "This is what I think," and sometimes he'll say, "Some people say this, some people say that, some people say this, some people say that," and he can't find a piece of empirical evidence to point you and say this is the one that makes the most sense. But sometimes he'll say, "Well, a lot of people say this, but this guy said this, but he had a reason for making that up, and so I kind of doubt it." So he's just trying to work through the possible stories and say, "Okay, can we find the real one?" Okay. After Numa had, in this manner, instituted these several orders of priests, he erected near the temple of Vesta what is called to this day Regia, or king's house, where he spent the most part of his time performing divine service. Again, by leadership, by example, this is what he thinks we should all be thinking about and caring about, and it's what he's doing. Instructing the priests or conversing with them on sacred subjects. He had another house, and it turns out that by doing that, he can solve diseases and keep the place from dying of drought and things like that. So maybe the people are learning that this is what they should care about. It's a little bit more spiritual than Lycurgus, who was very religious also, obviously, and cared about ethics and virtue, but more in a philosophical sense. I think Numa is coming off as more of a spiritualist. And you notice he sounds like a Christian spiritualist more than what you might imagine a pagan spiritualist is, with the things he's concerned with in the spiritual practices and the relationship he thinks he has to the gods and fear of God and all of this is something that, as C.S. Lewis says, the pagans and the Christians at the time of the debate, which is coming right at the beginning of Plutarch writing here, that's the transition period. The debate is between two groups of people who are more like each other than either of them are like us. He had another house up. All right, so introducing the priest and sacred subjects. He had another house upon the Mount Quirinalis, the site of which they show to this day. In all public processions and solemn prayers, criers were sent before to give notice to the people that they should forbear their work and rest. Rest, rest, it's time for the ceremony, right? Okay. They say that the Pythagoreans did not allow people to worship and pray to their gods by the way, but would have them go out from their houses direct with their minds set upon the duty. And Numa, in like manner, wished that his citizens would neither see nor hear any religious service in a perfunctory and inattentive manner, but laying aside all other occupations, should apply their minds to religion as to a most serious business, and that the streets should be free from all noise and cries that accompany manual labor and clear for the sacred solemnity. All right. None of this, on this day the priests go and do this parade and you guys keep doing your business and sell your donkey and bring your wares to market and stuff. And oh, you look at it, oh, this must be the day they're doing that. No, 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 no. Everybody stop what you're doing. We're having a ceremony. Everybody come out, look at the parade, pay attention and ask questions and think about what we're here to think about. Okay. Some traces of this custom remain at Rome to this day, for when the consul begins to take auspices or do sacrifice, they call out to the people, hoc age, a- hoc age, attend to this, whereby the auditors then present are admonished to compose and recollect themselves. Many other of these of his precepts resemble those of the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans said, for example, thou shalt not make a peck measure thy seat to sit on. Thou shalt not stir the fire with a sword. When thou goest out upon a journey, look not behind thee. When thou sacrificest to the celestial gods, let it be with an odd number, and when to the terrestrial with even. The significance of each of which precepts they would not commonly disclose. So some of Numa's traditions have no obvious meaning. Example: thou shalt not make libation to the gods of wine from an unpruned vine. No sacrifices shall be performed without meal. Turn round to pay adoration to the gods. Sit after you have worshipped. All right. So he's saying there's no obvious meaning to these laws, but they were laws that Numa wrote. If we're paying attention to Numa's project that he's consciously aware of, I think from the text, that he wants to shape people who are thinking about divine matters properly and making that their proper place, and that they not think of it as a burden, but think of it as the joyful way of living a good life and having a state with a political establishment that lasts and is honorable and fruitful and glorious rather than through war, and that they be afraid of doing the wrong things and crossing the gods because that will put an end to everything. You could put it in that context and say, okay, you get to eat when you make a sacrifice. No sacrificing to the gods without also your having a meal. Give the gods their portion, but remember, like, you're in the same thing here, and it's not about punishing. It's not a punishment that you have to sacrifice to the gods, and you should be miserable and hungry while doing it. You should be healthy and ready to serve the gods. Something like that, right? You can imagine some reasons why those might exist. I'm speculating here, obviously, but those are the types of laws, and he says there's no obvious reason why he did this, but those were some of the laws. Okay. The first two directions seem to denote the cultivation and subduing of the earth as a part of religion. And as to the turning which the worshippers are to use in divine adoration, it is said to represent the rotary motion of the world. Okay, I could It's another speculation. I don't know. But in my opinion, the meaning rather is that the worshiper, since the temples front the east, enters with his back to the rising sun, there faces round to the east, and so turns back to the god of the temple by this circular movement referring the fulfillment of his prayers in both divinity to both divinities. Maybe. It's a lot of speculation on my part and his. Unless indeed this change of posture may have a mystical meaning, like the Egyptian wheels, and signify to us the instability of human fortune, and that in whatever way God changes and turns our lot or condition, we should rest contented and accept it is as right and fitting. They say also that the sitting after worship was to be by way of omen of their petitions being granted and the blessing they asked assured to them. Again, as different courses of action are divided by intervals of rest, they might seat themselves after the completion of what they had done to seek favor of the gods for beginning something else. Okay, that's a good speculation, possibly. And so, it's, in other words, don't show up at the temple, offer your sacrifice, run out and go do the business you're supposed to do. Sit down after this, you're finishing something, get ready, make sure it's all done properly, wait for the gods to give you permission to go do something else, right? Like be a good servant to the gods. That sounds like a good speculation for a law like that. Okay. And this would very well suit with what we had before. The lawgiver wants to habituate us to make our petitions to the deity, not by the way, and as it were in a hurry when we have other things to do, but with time and leisure to attend to it. By such, he's trying to say this is the most important thing in your life. And you might not realize it, but start the practice of acting like it's more important than the other thing you want to go do today. By such discipline and schooling in religion, the city passed insensibly into such a submissiveness of temper and stood in such awe and reverence of the virtue of Numa that they received with an undoubted assurance whatever he delivered, though never so fabulous, and thought nothing incredible or impossible from him. Okay, so it's working. It's working also just to make them want to hear the rest of his laws. They're becoming the sorts of people who are like, whoa, it's not me versus everybody and my present moment desires like I'm a 2-year-old. It's I'm a part of something bigger. I'm a part of something way bigger and I'm playing an important part in it. And the way I perform my part matters. And what else do you have to tell us about how we can live on a much higher plane with much better, more transcendent concerns? Okay. So he transcendified their concerns is one way of thinking about what's happening here. Not mm. There goes a story that he once invited a great number of citizens to an entertainment at which the dishes in which the meat was served were very homely and plain, and the repast itself poor and ordinary fare. The guests seated, he began to tell them that the goddess had consulted with him, was that the goddess that consulted with him was then at that time come to him, when on a sudden the room was furnished with all sorts of costly drinking vessels and the tables loaded with rich meats and a most sumptuous entertainment. But the dialogue which is reported to have passed between him and Jupiter surpasses all the fabulous legends that were ever invented. They say that before Mount Aventine was inhabited or enclosed within the walls of the city, two demigods, Picus and Faunus, frequented the springs and thick shades of that place, which might be two satyrs, pans, except that they went about Italy playing the same sorts of tricks by skill in drugs and magic, as are ascribed by the Greeks to the dictyli of Mount Ida. Numa contrived one day to surprise these demigods by mixing wine and honey in the waters of the spring of which they usually drank. On finding themselves ensnared, they changed themselves into various shapes, dropping their own form and assuming every kind of unusual and hideous appearance. But when they saw they were safely entrapped and in no possibility of getting free, they revealed to him many secrets and future events, and particularly a charm for thunder and lightning still in use, performed with onions and hair and pilch cards. Some say they did not tell him the charm, but by their magic brought down Jupiter out of heaven, and that he then, in an angry manner, answering the inquiries, told Numa that if he would charm the thunder and lightning, he must do it with heads. How? Said Numa. With the heads of onions? No, replied Jupiter, of men. But Numa, willing to elude the cruelty of this receipt, turned it another way, saying, your meaning is the hairs of men's heads. No, replied Jupiter, with living. Pilchards, said Numa, interrupting him. These answers he had learnt from Agaria. Jupiter returned again to heaven pacified, and Elias, or propitious, the place was, in remembrance of him, called Elysium, from this Greek word, and the spell in this manner affected. Okay, we have a Moses negotiating with Yahweh situation here. It's also important to notice, I think, that the deity, the goddess that was the familiar of Numa, perhaps his wife, after his kindly earthly wife and wise earthly wife had perished, that she is a wood nymph, which means that she's the daughter of the river gods, I believe, which are older than Zeus, if we go back to the Greek. So there's an authority line. Like if Jupiter is the king god, the closest to a logos principle of proper human order for ruling over the terrestrial realm, the pagan perspective seems to be that there are other forces from creation that are still not under that realm exactly. Okay. Like in the pantheon, they have to be ordered under the authority of Zeus or Jupiter, but there's these other sources of divinity that are outside of that still. And she would be one of them. I believe I've got that all correct. So anyway, otherwise you might say to yourself, what the heck's going on here? Is Jupiter in charge or not? In any event, also notice working out daemons or genies, things that change shape, things that live in that middle realm between the land of the divine where the gods can dwell and the land of the terrestrial where the people dwell. Those are incompatible opposites. So there must be a third principle, the daemonic. And that going back to the C.S. Lewis that we've been reading, that we're going to hopefully be able to continue reading very soon, that there was logical, rational reasons for positing the inhabitation of that realm with an intelligence, just like the earthly realm is peopled with intelligent creatures that rule it, and the divine realm as well has the gods or have God. So these ideas become Christian, and these pagan ideas are themselves much closer to medieval Christianity than one might expect at first. Um, anyway, we don't have to go off on that detour right now, but that is what the main thing we've been reading while we happen to do this one-off thing of a few of Plutarch's. Okay, we're almost done. Um, and once this is done, of course, we're going to have to do a reading on the comparison of Numa with Lycurgus. If you haven't watched the Lycurgus video, go watch it because I think it's a better story, I think, even than the Numa one. But this Numa one is pretty impressive, and being able to compare the two is be very interesting. The two lawgivers, as told in the histories of Plutarch, the lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, writing in, I believe, 75 AD, of Lycurgus, who was the lawgiver to Sparta. And we learned quite a lot of things about Sparta that were not what we thought, and about their laws and about their traditions and how they were established when we read that. And he was working in 900 BC. And now we're reading about Numa giving the laws to the Romans in the fledgling beginning of the Roman state in 700 BC. But the writing is happening in that late classical, early transition period into the medieval. So we get to have a foot in everything here while we're reading this. Okay. These stories, laughable as they are, show us the feelings which people then, by force of habit, entertained towards the deity. Okay, hold on. And Numa's own thoughts are said to have been fixed to that degree on divine objects that he once, when a message was brought to him that enemies are approaching, answered with a smile, and I am sacrificing. Okay. We've got the idea of Numa. The character of Lycurgus was very philosophical in a lot of ways, with a respect for the poetic and the religious. Numa is basically a high priest. I mean, he's like, look, I got this life thing figured out. It's about sacrificing properly. It's about being afraid of the gods and doing what you need to do to be in right relationship with them and in right orientation to them and serving them properly. And if you're doing that, your state's going to be fine. Your life's going to be fine. The war's going to be fine. You're going to have the ability to establish a political order that lasts. Okay, so we know who Numa is. Now, let's go back here. In 75 AD, while Plutarch is writing this, he says these stories are laughable. It's laughable that we would have a little bit of witchcraft that emerged from a negotiation between Numa and Jupiter himself, who came down to say, you have to sacrifice the heads of people to get lightning to strike where you want it to. And Numa didn't think that wise and negotiated with him in different ways and maybe tricked him into, whatever, creating a type of magic where maybe you can strike lightning with this, whatever. This is laughable. But why is he saying it's laughable? Is he saying it's laughable because he thinks Jupiter's laughable? Or is he saying it's laughable because he thinks Numa would never act that way? Is he saying it's laughable because obviously the gods from the highest aether realm can't come down to earth in that way without messengers mediating? Okay, there's different ways in which it's laughable, potentially, and we'll leave it open for right now. But we'll say that the historian is mentioning the fact of these legends and fables and stories to say this shows a few things. One, those warlike people who barely had a state and barely had an identity of different warlike people coming together in a coalition to sort of steal things from people who needed an identity and a state have been so constituted by the work of Numa that their mindset is obsessed with these religious ideas. And when they come up with stories for Numa, they're coming up with stories of his counseling with the gods themselves as the highest and most important thing. And that's where we get our identity. And it also shows Numa's thoughts that everybody recognized that, well, whatever's Numa's doing when you're not watching, it probably has something to do with the gods. Right? You can believe this story I came up with that Numa was up in the mountains trapping some little genie demigod daemons that are out causing trouble with drugs and mischief and stuff, and that he tried to get some knowledge from them for the administration of the state or whatever. Because what else would Numa be doing? Obviously, you can believe that story. Where's Numa? He's not here. He's probably sacrificing at the temple, right? So it shows not only that it's the type of story that would be made up by a people who are now completely obsessed with the idea of we've got to get this religion thing right, but also it's a story about a person that they could believe was out doing stuff like that. Okay. It was he also that built the temples of faith and Terminus. This guy just doesn't stop building temples and taught the Romans that the name of faith was the most solemn oath that they could swear. They still use it. And to the god Terminus or boundary, they offer to this day both public and private sacrifices upon the borders and stone marks of their land, living victims now. Though anciently those sacrifices were solemnized without blood. Okay, remember, he doesn't think that you should be doing a lot of bloody things when sacrificing to the gods. He wants that not to be the way it's done. But of course, the Romans eventually become pretty bloody even in their sacrifices. But that's not the way it was founded. For Numa reasoned that the god of boundaries, who watched over peace and testified to fair dealing, should have no concern with blood. Right? He's establishing a high order of priests whose basic job is to be mediators to stop war from happening. And he says, here's a couple of things: faith, um, fidelis, semper fi. Like, let's make that's our highest swear. If you want to promise something, promise that you are actually integral, that what you say is what you mean, and you are what you pretend to be. Also, here's another temple: the borders. Are you expanding them? Are they being invaded? Stop. We need to sacrifice that the borders would just be so divine that you're not even thinking about changing them. This is how he's founding Rome. We'll see how long it lasts. Numa reasoned that the god of boundaries who watched over peace and testified to fair dealing should have no concern with blood. It is very clear that it was this king who first prescribed bounds to the territory of Rome, for Romulus would but have openly betrayed how much he had encroached on his neighbor's lands, had he ever set limits to his own. For boundaries are indeed a defense to those who choose to observe them, but are only a testimony against the dishonesty of those who break through them. The truth is, the portion of lands which the Romans possessed at the beginning was very narrow until Romulus enlarged them by war. All those acquisitions Numa now divided amongst the indigent commonality, wishing to do away with that extreme want which is a compulsion to dishonesty. Okay, so remember, Romulus using war, pulling it together. How are we going to turn this into an actual people? Enter Numa, sent from the gods, very pious, inspired at least. What's he going to do? Let's say the borders matter and they need to stay here and they need to be protected in peace. He's doing all this stuff he's doing. And then he's saying, okay, here's another thing that's going to keep this city healthy. This is what we own. This is our city. I'm dividing it up. Everybody gets enough. Everybody gets enough because we're just going to have war amongst ourselves if people feel the need to steal. So we're going to start out with everybody has enough. And by turning the people to husbandry to bring them as well as their lands into better order. For there is no employment that gives so keen and quick a relish for peace as husbandry and country life, which leave in men all that kind of courage that makes them ready to fight in defense of their own, while it destroys the license that breaks out into acts of injustice and rapacity. Numa, therefore, hoping agriculture would be a sort of charm to captivate the affections of his people to peace, and viewing it rather as a means to moral than to economic profit, divided all the lands into several parcels, to which he gave the name of pagus, or parish, and over every one of them he ordained chief overseers, and taking a delight sometimes to inspect his colonies in person, he formed his judgment of every man's habits by the results, of which, being witness himself, he preferred those to honors and employments who had done well, and by rebukes and reproaches incited the indolent and careless to improvement. Okay. Okay. So there's something we have to pause on here. Rome has a lot to do with Apollo in a sense, but not the way Numa wanted to found it. The way Numa wanted to found it was, let's have some big families and nice farms, and everybody just be very rural and country folk, because you're going to really want to fight to protect yours, but you're not going to want to go fight and steal from other people. And let's make sure that your honor and your status amongst people is relegated and tied right to how well you're taking care of your own. How's your house look? Are you taking care of it properly? Awesome, man. Good for you. Hey, buddy, this place could use a little help. There's some trash on the front lawn. Like, maybe we could find a way to keep it a little nicer. You're a Roman after all, you know? So he's encouraging and admonishing people to be about that sort of a thing. But of all his measures, the most commended was his distribution of the people by their trades into companies or guilds, for as the city consisted, or rather did not consist of, but was divided into two different tribes, the diversity between which could not be effaced, and in the meantime prevented all unity and caused perpetual tumult and ill blood, reflecting how hard substances that do not readily mix when in the lump may, by being beaten into powder, in that minute form he combined. He resolved to divide the whole population into a number of small divisions, and thus hoped, by introducing other distinctions, to obliterate the original and great distinction which would be lost among the smaller. So, distinguishing the whole people by the several arts and trades, he formed the companies of musicians, goldsmiths, carpenters, dyers, shoemakers, skinners, braziers, and potters, and all other handicraftsmen. He composed and reduced into a single company, appointing every one their proper courts, councils, and religious observances. In this manner, all factious distinctions began for the first time to pass out of use, no person any longer being either thought of or spoken of under the notion of a Sabine or a Roman, a Romulian or a Tatian. and the new division became a source of general harmony and intermixture. Now, there's a bit of wisdom. Okay. I got my Roman friends, and we're doing our Roman cooking, and we're doing our Roman pottery making. And over here, we got my Sabine friends, and they're doing their Sabine cooking and their Sabine pottery. And we're not really one. Here's a new distinction: divide everything up. Everybody's got what they need. Take care of your house. We're going to care about that. But we're not just going to live in the country. We're also going to be a little bit more developed than that. Here's what we're going to do: we're going to make a guild. Everybody who makes copper stuff get together. We're making copper. I'm making something up, but shoemakers get together, learn from each other, compete with each other, honor each other. It's not that you're a Roman shoemaker. Hey, show me how that Sabine shoelace thing works. I've got a new innovation. We're all working together because we're focused on shoemaking. And so we can come together as brothers, and we have more in common with each other than we do with, like, a Roman shoemaker has more in common with a Sabine shoemaker than he does with a Roman skinner. Okay, so he's helping them get a new identity that way, and and that's probably quite useful. These constitutionalists are quite clever. He is also much to be commended for the repeal, or rather amendment, of that law which gives power to fathers to sell their children. He exempted such as were married conditionally, that it had been with the liking and consent of their parents, for it seemed a hard thing that a woman who had given herself in marriage to a man whom she judged free should afterwards find herself living with a slave. Okay. So apparently, even if you were grown, you could be sold as a slave. Even if you were of marriageable age and married already, the laws originally were, if your parents sell you, they can still sell you. They still own you. This is a very important principle in this sort of psychology of thinking about, and we read The Clouds a few years ago by Aristophanes. So the idea that fathers own their children, that doesn't go away. So apparently that had been the law, and he said, I'm going to make an amendment to that law. And the amendment is, if a woman marries a man, that man's father can't make him a slave. He can't sell him into slavery because he's got to take care of the wife here. Like, we're going to maybe put a little bit of a wedge there. You leave your father and mother and cleave to your wife. There's a new thing going on here. We're going to respect that. The woman doesn't have to be married to a slave just because this her father-in-law's an asshole or something. You know what I mean? Like, excuse my language, but that seems like a good amendment, at least. He attempted also the formation of a calendar, not with absolute exactness, yet not without some scientific knowledge. During the reign of Romulus, they had let their months run on within any certain or equal term, without any certain or equal term. Some of them contained 20 days, others 35, others more. They had no sort of knowledge of the inequality of the motions of the sun and moon. They only kept to the one rule that the whole course of the year contained 360 days. So they're getting through their months. They got a number for the year, but not really for the months. That makes a lot of commonality and sense and regularity, or is related to the heavenly bodies tightly enough. Numa, calculating the difference between the lunar and the solar year at 11 days, for that the moon completed her anniversary course in 354 days and the sun in 365. To remedy this incongruity, doubled the 11 days, and every other year added an intercalary month to follow February, consisting of 22 days, and called by the Romans the month of Mercedinus. This amendment, however, itself in course of time came to need other amendments. He also altered the order of the months. For March, which was reckoned the first, he put into the third place, and January, which was the 11th, he made the first, and February, which was the 12th, and last, he made the second. Many will have it, and that it was Numa also who added the 2 months of January and February, for in the beginning they had had a year of 10 months, as they are barbarians who count only 3. The Arcadians in Greece had but 4. The Acarnanians 6. The Egyptian year, at first, they say, was of 1 month, afterwards of 4. And so, though they live in the newest of all countries, they have the credit of being a more ancient nation than any, and reckon in their genealogies a prodigious number of years, counting months, that is, as years. That the Romans at first comprehended the whole year within 10 and not 12 months plainly appears by the name of the last. I was going to point that out, right? December. Decembre is 10. Dece, 10, right? Octo, 8. Nueve, right? 9. September, October, November, December, 7, 8, 9, 10. How come that's 9, 10, 11, 12? Okay. Meaning the 10th month, and that the March, which was the first, is likewise evident from for the 5th month after it was called Quintilis, quin, 5, quinte. All right. And the 6th, Sextilis. Okay, Sextilis, 6. And so the rest. Whereas if January and February had in this account preceded March, Quintilis would have been 5th in name and 7th in ranking. It was also natural that March, dedicated to Mars, should be Romulus's first, and April, named from Venus or Aphrodite, his second month. In it, they sacrifice to Venus, and the women bathe in the kalends, or first day of it, with myrtle garlands on their heads. But others, because of its being and not will not allow for the derivation of this word from Aphrodite, but say it is called April from aperio, Latin for to open, because this is the month of high spring and opens and discloses the buds and flowers. The next is called May from Maia, the mother of Mercury, to whom it is sacrificed, to whom it is sacred. Then June follows, so called from Juno. Some, however, derive them from the two ages, old and young, majores being their name for older, and juniors for younger men. Of the other months, they gave denominations according to their order. So the 5th was called Quintilis, Sextilis, the 6th, and the rest September, October, November, December. Afterwards, Quintilis received the name of Julius from Caesar, who defeated Pompey, and also Sextilis, that of Augustus, from the second. So there we get August, from the second Caesar who had that title. Domitian also, in imitation, gave the two other following months his own names of Germanicus and Domitianus. But on his being slain, they've recovered their ancient denominations of September and October. The two last are the only ones that have kept their names throughout without any alteration. Of the months which were added or transposed in their order by Numa, February comes from Februa and is as much a purification month. In it, they make offerings to the dead and celebrate the Lupercalia, which in most points resembles a purification. January, which is called from Janus, and precedence given to it by Numa before March, which was dedicated to the god Mars, because, as I conceive, he wished to make every opportunity of intimating that the arts and studies of peace are to be preferred before those of war. Goes along with a lot of what he did. For this Janus, whether in remote, so isn't that interesting? He moves the month of Mars of March, which was the first month. He goes, we're going to put that after these two other things we think about first. What did he do earlier? We're going to take the arguments and move them here, and we're going to do it this way. We're going to take the warlike thing and put it there. We're going to have the borders and say it's really about peace and keeping established order. All right. All he's doing is taking this warlike group of disparate people and trying to conglomerate them together into a single identity that is concerned with peace instead of war. That's his aim. And this is how Rome starts. For this Janus, whether in remote antiquity he were a demigod or a king, was certainly a great lover of civil and social unity, and one who reclaimed men from brutal and savage living, for which reason they figure him with two faces, to represent the two states and conditions out of the one of which he brought mankind to lead them into the other. All right, this is it. The war thing, we're emerging out of that. Time to get civilized, everybody. So he's a civilizing, constitutionalizing force, this Numa guy. His temple at Rome has two gates, which they call the gates of war, because they stand open in the time of war and shut in the times of peace. of which latter there was very seldom an example. For as the Roman Empire was enlarged and extended, it was so encompassed with barbarous nations and enemies to be resisted that it was seldom or never at peace. Lycurgus established a constitution of a people and a law that actually lasted without breaking. Numa is doing his best, and maybe without him, it would have been much worse, and probably the whole place would have collapsed in utter catastrophe and tyranny and warlikeness. But he's the countervailing force if that is what would have happened. Anyway, only in the time of Augustus Caesar, after he had much overcome Antony, this temple was shut, as likewise once before when Marcus Attilius and Titus Manlius were consuls. But then it was not long before wars breaking out, the gates were opened again. But during the reign of Numa, whose gates were were never seen open a single day, but continued constantly shut for a space of 43 years together, such an entire and universal cessation of war existed. For not only had the people of Rome itself been softened and charmed into a peaceful temper by the just and mild rule of a pacific prince, but even the neighboring cities, as if some salubrious and gentle air had blown from Rome upon them, began to experience a change of feeling, and partook in the general longing for the sweets of peace and order, and for life employed in the quiet tillage of soil, bringing up of children, and worshipping of the gods. Festival days and sports and the secure and peaceful interchange of friendly visits and hospitalities prevailed all throughout the whole of Italy then. The love of virtue and justice flowed from Numa's wisdom as from a fountain, and the serenity of his spirit diffused itself like a calm on all sides, so that the hyperboles of poets were flat and tame to express what then existed, as that over the iron shield the spiders hang their threads, or that rust eats the pointed spear and double-edged sword. No more is heard the trumpet's brazen roar. Sweet sleep is banished from our eyes no more. For during the whole reign of Numa there was neither war nor sedition, nor innovation in the state, nor any envy or ill will to his person, nor plot or conspiracy from views of ambition. Either fear of the gods that were thought to watch over him, or reverence for his virtue, or divine felicity of fortune in his days preserved human innocence, made his reign, by whatever means, a living example and verification of that saying which Plato long afterwards ventured to pronounce, that the sole and only hope of respite or remedy for human evils was in some happy conjunction of events which should unite in a single person the power of a king and the wisdom of a philosopher, so as to elevate virtue to control and mastery over vice. The wise man is blessed in himself, and blessed also are the auditors who can bear and receive those words which flow from his mouth, and perhaps, too, there is no need of compulsion or menaces to affect the multitude. For the mere sight itself of a shining and conspicuous example of virtue in the life of their prince will bring them spontaneously to virtue and to conformity with that blameless and blessed life of goodwill and mutual concord, supported by temperance and justice, which is the highest benefit that human means can confer. And he is the truest ruler who can best introduce it into the hearts and practice of his subjects. It is the praise of Numa that no one seems ever to have discerned this so clearly as he. So that's interesting. And we might imagine historically, like with Lycurgus, he seemed to have the ability to impart a vision and a character into others, and to set up the habits that would have them preserve it. With Numa, it seems like maybe he's so spiritual and so great that when he's there, everybody is in line and working in the right harmonious cosmic way. But when he's not, it doesn't really stick. I mean, we've got to compare these two from the historical judgment perspective. And I'm not sure what um, Plutarch is going to say when he does his comparison of Numa with Lycurgus, but we're anticipating that now. All right, let's take a short break and we'll have another simultaneous sip and then we'll finish the last few paragraphs of this. If you missed yesterday's recording, we read Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, the Lacedaemonians, Lacedaemonians, the Spartans from Lycurgus. So in Lacedaemania, Lacedaemon. Anyway, we read that yesterday, and it was really, really awesome. Today, we're reading something very impressive, and even reading about Numa makes you want to just sort of be a little more spiritual, and it's challenging, even looking at his life. So you can imagine that perhaps that is the explanation for why Rome, founded by him legislatively and constitutionally in this way, at least lasted as long as when he was there in that way. Um, so we'll finish in a moment, but first get your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos, your stein, your canteen jug or flask, your vessel of absolutely any kind. I see you. And join me now for the unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens right now. Go. Thank you for joining me as we have this fun spin-off read of Plutarch. We might do a few more of these. Um, but the main thing we're doing right now is we're reading through the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, and we're also doing complementary things. We've been reading a lot of Aristotle and Platonic sources relevant to that, and C.S. Lewis's work on how the medievals thought, all of which is actually helping us to interpret and understand this work better. Okay, let's get to it. As to his children and wives, there is a diversity of reports by several authors. Okay, once again, he's going to have to sort through the sources. He's going to teach us how to do history while he works it out himself. Some will have it that he never had any other wife than Tatia, nor more children than one daughter called Pompilia. Others will have it that he has left four sons, namely Pompo, Pinus, Calpus, and Mamercus, every one of whom had issue, and from them descended the noble and illustrious families of Pomponi, Paneri, Calpurni, and Mamerci, which, for this reason, took also the surname of Rex, or king. But there's a third set of writers who say that these pedigrees were but a piece of flattery used by writers who, to gain favor with those great families, made them fictitious genealogies from the lineage of Numa, and that Pompilia was not the daughter of Tatia, but Lucretia, another wife whom he married after he came to his kingdom. However, all of them agree in opinion that she was married to the son of that Marcius, who persuaded him to accept the government and accompanied him to Rome, where, as a mark of honor, he was chosen into the Senate. And after the death of Numa, standing in competition with Talus Hostilius for the kingdom, and being disappointed of the election, in discontent, killed himself. His son Marcius, however, who had married Pompilia, continuing at Rome, was the father of Ancus Marcius, who succeeded Tullus Hostilius in the kingdom and was by 5 years of age when Numa died. Okay. Numa lived something above 80 years. And then, as Piso writes, was not taken out of this world by a sudden or acute disease, but died of old age and by a gradual and gentle decline. At his funeral, all the glories of his life were consummated. When all the neighboring states in alliance and amity with Rome met to honor and grace the rites of his interment with garlands and public presents. So not just the Roman people, but the people living peacefully around them. The senators carried the bier on which his corpse was laid, and the priests followed and accompanied the solemn procession, while a general crowd in which women and children took part followed with such cries and weeping as if they had bewailed the death and loss of some most dear relation taken away in the flower of age, and not an old and worn out king. It is said that his body, by his particular command, was not burnt, but they but that they made in conformity with his order two stone coffins and buried both under the hill Juniculum, in one of which his body was laid, and the other his sacred books, which, as the Greek legislators their tables, he had written out for himself, but had so long inculcated the contents of them, whilst he lived, into the minds and hearts of the priests, that their understandings became fully possessed with the whole spirit and purpose of them. And he therefore bade that they should be buried with his body, as though such holy precepts could not, without irreverence, be left to circulate in mere lifeless writings. For this, so we saw something similar. Lycurgus refused to write down laws and forced people to memorize the poetry of them. He wanted them embodied in the people. And similarly, we have another constitutive legislator here who is saying, I want you to be the living embodiment of these laws. I don't want you to have to reference them. And we saw reasons. We won't do this digression for long, but we saw reasons why you can imagine a corrupted people could more easily corrupt the laws by making a bunch of arguments about what does this comma mean? It's like, no, be this way. And you know what I'm talking about. And we see that same thing that we saw with Lycurgus happening here in this way. For this very reason, they say the Pythagoreans bade that their precepts should not be committed to paper, but rather preserved in the living memories of those who were worthy to receive them. And when some of their out of the way and abstruse geometrical processes had been divulged to an unworthy person, they said the gods threatened to punish this wickedness and profanity by a single and widespreading calamity. With these several instances concurring to show a similarity in the lives of Numa and Pythagoras, we may easily pardon those who seek to establish the fact of a real acquaintance between them. So he thought historically there wasn't one, but he's keep noting the fact that there's reasons to think why someone might imagine there could have been. All right. Valerius Antius writes that the books which were buried in the aforesaid chest or coffin of stone were 12 volumes of Holy Writ and 12 others of Greek philosophy, and that about 400 years afterwards, when P. Cornelius and M. Bibius were consuls, in a time of heavy rains, a violent torrent washed away the earth and dislodged the chests of stone, and their covers falling off, one of them was found wholly empty, without the least relic of any human body. In the other were the books before mentioned, which the praetor Petilius, having read and perused, made oath in the Senate that, in his opinion, it was not fit for their contents to be made public to the people, whereupon the volumes were all carried to the comitium and there burnt. Well, that's a bummer. It is the fortune of all good men that their virtue rises in glory after their deaths, and that the envy which evil men conceive against them never outlives them long. Some have the happiness even to see it die before them. But in Numa's case, also the fortunes of the succeeding kings served as foils to set off the brightness of his reputation. For after him there were 5 kings, the last of whom ended his old age in banishment, being deposed from his crown. Of the other 4, 3 were assassinated and murdered by treason. The other, who was Tullus Hostilius, that immediately succeeded Numa, derived his virtues and especially his devotion to religious worship as a cowardly, derided his virtues and especially his devoted devotion to religious worship as a cowardly and mean spirited occupation, and diverted the minds of the people to war, but was checked in those youthful insolences, and was himself driven by an acute and tormenting disease into superstitions wholly different from Numa's piety, and left others also to participate in these terrors when they died by the stroke of a thunderbolt. Holy mackerel. So what what we see here are a few things, right? One, right religion is different than superstition. Witchcraft and magic and bloodshed and all of that other stuff, that's not what Numa's about. Numa's about right religion. Also, whatever these Roman people are, constituting them is very difficult. A character like Numa's seems to be almost miraculous. I mean, even if you don't take any of the stories of he knew this goddess and all that other stuff that became legend, no, I'm not saying for that reason. I'm saying to take a people like that and for the entire time till you're late in your 80s to have them be the sort of people that are nothing like what they are as soon as you're dead and gone and they go back again. You can't normally do that. Usually there's intrigue in court and someone stabbing you and like that stuff should have happened, but not while he was there. So whatever was going on with the Romans, Numa, as the founder and attempted constitutor of the people, was very different from the way the people ended up being, I guess. Um, we're going to have to look at the way that Plutarch compares Lycurgus and Numa, and we'll probably do that tomorrow, um, Lord willing. We see that the pagans had ways of approaching religion that were much more like what you would imagine a medieval Catholic monk or something was approaching it, as opposed to what we sometimes imagine in our cartoon version. We also saw that they understood the Earth was round and the globes were the stars were globes which dwarfed the Earth, and that the Earth moved round the sun. I mean, they had all of that understanding as well. But their idea of the cosmology, of the spiritual architecture, of the relationship between Earth dwellers and realms that are transcendent was another thing altogether. Um, I think I think I'd rather meditate on the character of Numa and be quiet from this point on. So I'm going to end talking. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time. And remember, we give links to join us on the live stream so you can appear on camera or with a avatar or something. If you'd like to come and join the conversation, you should find that link in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.